as has occurred with the Juukan Gorge. Never again. Linda Burney, Shadow Social Services Minister, joins me now. We are going to talk about cashless welfare, but I wanted to start on this. This inquiry calls on a moratorium on all mining projects, new projects that could threaten sacred Indigenous sites across WA until new legislation is passed. It's a big call. The mining industry is saying, well, this might really hold things up. What do you make of this?
The Juukan Gorge incident was one of the worst examples of destruction of cultural sites in this country. And it's incredibly serious. Rio does deserve to have the finger pointed on it. And I understand that the report, which was a unanimous report, talks about Rio paying compensation, rectifying the site, and a moratorium on the destruction. So those things are really appropriate. The reputational damage for Rio is massive, and they understand this. And I think the other point to make is that this cultural material and the damage done to the relationship with the traditional owners will never be fixed. But the important point, Tom, is to understand that this cultural material that's been destroyed is actually the heritage of everyone. So Australia is a poorer place for the destruction.
Indeed, it's a part of our history. There are, I suppose, things you see in Rome, for example, ancient ruins. This is our version of it, if you like. So there's support for obviously compensation and the approach taken there, and also trying to get something back in the site's place. But there is pushback on what happens on a moratorium on all new mining projects. Do you understand concerns from Mining Council? You say, well,
well, of course, the Mining Council would have concerns, but I guess the weighing up is money versus irreplaceable cultural material that happens to be, tens of thousands of years old, and Australia has to come to terms with that, as do the mining companies. I note that the Western Australian government is changing its cultural heritage laws, but I think there are still massive questions to be answered by Minister Lee in particular about the lack of, and the report goes to it, the lack of communication between federal ministers in relation to this issue.
Let's get onto the cashless welfare card. So the trial will roll on now essentially in these 4 sites. Rex Patrick wants evidence to prove it's a good policy. Would you be open to looking at empirical evidence on the card if it does have good outcomes? Open to this proposition?
Well, I'm going to be extremely clear about this. The legislation that finally went through the Senate last night on the cashless debit card is a pale imitation of what the government actually wanted. So there's been enormous wins and a massive back down. The permanent sites that the government wanted are temporary, and the mandatory application of this card in the Northern Territory is going to be voluntary. I am very disappointed with Sterling Griff, but overall, this card is punitive. And Labor's position has been crystal clear on this from the very beginning, and that is that we are not per se against the card, we're against mandatory income management.
So just on that though, this is what you say, voluntary is fine. If you're talking about someone with a gambling or alcohol addiction, then how will voluntary work? The nature of addiction suggests that if they have the opportunity to use the cash, they will.
The position that Labor has put forward in terms of voluntary is that it must be voluntary and not a mandatory application. Mandatory application of income management does not work. If people, and the Labor has also been very clear, there are certain circumstances where income management is appropriate, particularly if there's been a child safety issue or something along those lines. But the government has absolutely walked back from where they wanted this to be. And the empirical evidence that you're talking about is important.
So just on that though, so they've got this warning from Rex Patrick. If they do go about getting that evidence, and we're talking about, you know, crime rates, outcomes for children, really important stuff, domestic violence and abuse rates. If there is empirical evidence showing that these trial sites do bring that down on this mandatory basis, would you be open to it?
Labor will not support mandatory income
No matter the evidence?
Will not support mandatory income management.
No matter the evidence?
Because we know it doesn't work.
But if the evidence suggests it does, that's what I'm saying.
Let's be clear, the government has the evidence and they are refusing to release their own inquiry, which they paid $2.5 million for, and they made these decisions before looking at any of the evidence.
And that's fair enough to call for that,
themselves.
but I'm just saying if this next trial does have evidence and you can look at that, why not at least be open to it?
Labor is opposed to mandatory income management. We will support voluntary because that's where people realise they've got a problem, realise they need help and will cooperate. But when it's mandatory, a blanket application, it is discriminatory and we will not be part of that.
I know you need to get to a vote, so we'll have to leave it there. We'll talk again perhaps in the new year. Linda Burney, thanks for your time.
Merry Christmas, Tom.
You too. United States Ambassador